page 29. Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, by David Benatar, 2006. Chapter 1. 1.4 A Reader's Guide. Not every reader may be inclined or have time to read the whole book, and thus I offer some advice on prioritizing. The most important chapters are Chapter 2, and more specifically the section entitled "Day Why Coming into Existence is Always a Harm," and Chapter 3. The opening section of the concluding chapter, Chapter 7, is also important for those who think that my conclusions should be rejected on the grounds of being deeply counterintuitive. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 all presuppose the conclusions of Chapters 2 and 3 and thus cannot be read profitably without the earlier chapters in mind. Whereas Chapter 5 does not rest on Chapter 4, Chapter 6 does presuppose the conclusions of Chapter 4, but not of Chapter 5. This logical ordering of the chapters roughly approximates another ordering. Chapter 2 is the A bad news, Chapter 3 the A worse news, and one or more of Chapters 4, 5, and 6, depending on one's views, contains the A worst news. Much of this book will be readily accessible to an intelligent reader who has no background in philosophy. There are some sections that, of necessity, are somewhat more technical. Although grasping every detail of these sections may be more difficult, the gist of the argument should nonetheless be clear. However, there are some sections that a reader less interested in the more technical details could skip. This is true of the occasional paragraphs scattered throughout the book, but it is also true of more substantial sections. In Chapter 5, the first 6 paragraphs of A4 kinds of interest are crucial to that chapter. Those readers not interested in how the taxonomy maps onto competing taxonomies in the literature of moral philosophy may skip the rest of that section. The most technical parts of the book are in Chapter 6, in the section entitled A Solving Problems in Moral Theory about Population. In that section I show how my views help solve problems that have been discussed in an extensive philosophical literature about future people and optimum population size. Those without knowledge of and interest in this literature could skip this section. Doing so will make it somewhat more difficult to understand much of my discussion, later in Chapter 6, about phased extinction. Some of that discussion is also quite technical and thus could also be avoided. Any reader who does that need only know that I argue that my views might allow, under some conditions, for a phased extinction, whereby fewer and fewer children are brought into existence in each of, only, a few successive generations, rather than an immediate cessation of all baby-making. Page 30.